And so there was a parent leaving golf that decided to do something that I do not recommend anyone does. On like a single back road, they, driving 30 miles an hour, hit a dead stop and decided to do a U-turn in the middle, right? So just like, they were just like, they decided to flip around, like right in the middle, and so here's the deal. I saw it in time, and I slammed on my brakes and did not hit this car. But the car behind me did not. And my ex-girlfriend hit the back of my car. Okay, now here's the deal. She was mortified. She was absolutely mortified. But if you know me, like, it takes a lot to really bother me. And so I thought it was funny. I pulled over. She's weeping. And I popped my trunk. I had 2 lawn chairs. I threw them out, and I was like, come on, let's sit. We're just going to hang out until our dads get here and sort this out. And like, we'll be good. It's snot, the whole deal. Like, it was her first car accident. And but it was okay. Honestly, I think it brought us a little closer. I think it healed some things, and we were good. Like, neither of us were mad about the accident. Like, it was fine. But I had 2 other friends, all part of Vox with me at the time, all close. We would all get to school. I know I've shared this. We would all get to school at like 6:30 in the morning. And we would all park next to each other because nobody's in the parking lot at that time. So we'd all park next to each other. We'd pull out lawn chairs. We'd have a Bible study, and we'd hang until class starts. And so we would do that, and then and we'd always park in the back. We parked in the back because because you were gonna wait anyway for the Baker line, for traffic to get out. You're gonna wait like 15, 20 minutes. That's just given. You're gonna sit in a car line. So here's what we do. At the end of the school day, we'd bust out those same lawn chairs, we'd sit, we'd hang out. Sometimes we would pack coolers with drinks, and we would just hang out. Like, it was just a good time. And so we would hang out, but we were also pretty goofy. And so there was one time that we all decided, like after the car line had died down, we were going to try and race to see who could get out fastest, right? And so we didn't get far. And here's a great lesson of the difference between, I think, men and boys. Because I think men would not do this, but boys would. And so we all raced to the car, or our cars, and we all drove very different things. I drove a grandma car, 100%. 100%. My car audio would max out on VeggieTales. Like, I couldn't even get that loud enough. It just was not. It was not a tough, big car in any means. I think they put a motorcycle engine in it. I think it was like that. And then I had a friend who drove a Suburban, a jacked up Suburban. Okay, so like, my head isn't even as high as like the wheels. Like, it was huge. And then another friend of mine drove this lowrider coupe, right? So he had this black Pontiac Firebird, and it was low, and it was sweet. And so everybody's running, but my friend Josh got to the Suburban first, and so he's firing it up as Andrew, my friend in the Firebird, throws open his door, and Josh hits the gas. And the door just caught the wheel, crunch. Now, here's the deal. In that moment, that was not as like silly cute as the other car accident. That one was furious. Like, they were mad. Like, you idiot. Like, why did you throw your door open in my lane? You idiot. You saw I was driving. What were you doing? And so they were mad back and forth. The issue didn't get better, though. Because when their parents got together and kind of talked through, hey, here's what we want to do. We don't want to go through insurance, because how many of y'all know insurance is expensive? So didn't want to go through insurance, and so they're like, here's what we'll do. We'll pay this out of pocket. And I just remember my friend Josh, who had to pay for his friend's door. And he didn't have a job at that point, and his dad was like, you're going to get a job, and you're going to pay for the door. And I remember it was real tough because Josh couldn't hang out with us because he had to get a job and work every day. And he was working like he was in high school. I remember our senior year, he was working 10 to 12-hour days after school. Just trying to pay off for this door, right, to fix this car door. And I'll tell you that there's some things that it's like really easy for us to like brush off. You know what I mean? Like there's some things that happen in life and that for you it's like, oh, this is really easy to brush off. And then there's some other things that when they happen, some other people might not understand it, but it hits you different. Like this situation hits me different. You know, I remember, this is going to be a terrible example. I remember I had a friend, this is actually also my ex-girlfriend. This is poor girl. Okay, so we were in school, and she broke this like beautiful necklace. She loved it. She wore it all the time. I think somebody important gave it to her. And I remember I was just like so unfazed. I was like, come on, it's just stuff. And she was furious. Right? Because that pain hits her different than it hit me, right? And then later in my senior year, I had somebody in the neighborhood carve 420 into my hood with a key, right? So just a giant 420 in the hood of my grandma car. And I'll tell you, I was pretty mad about that one. Like at that point, I wasn't going, it's stuff, you know, right? Like at that point, I was like, it's just items, it's just belongings, right? At that moment, I was like, who doesn't like me? Let's go, right? And when something hits you different, I want to talk to you tonight about what our response should be. We're in a series called Fight Club. We've been talking in Fight Club about really how you deal with issues with other Christians. How do you deal with issues with other Christians, with people who, hey, we're supposed to be on the same team. The Bible calls us a family, says that we love each other more than real families do. But here's the deal. Sometimes we fight as nasty as families. Sometimes church people, you're like, oh my goodness, I do not like them. And what do we do about that? Because Jesus sees such a better, more beautiful, more perfect picture of what God's people should look like together. And so in this series, we've talked about, hey, listen, there are some situations that we really got to deal with. The church is not perfect people. It's far from it. The church is not everybody in here is good. In fact, it's far from it. There's a lot of, y'all are jacked up, okay? I'm jacked up, okay? Here's the deal. We're not perfect people. And so what do we do when those imperfections clash? Because inevitably they will. Inevitably, something's going to happen. If you got a Bible, go with me tonight to 2 Corinthians chapter 2. 2 Corinthians chapter 2. And last week, how many of you were here last week? Let me just see like a little hand. Okay, good. All right. Last week, we had a lot of fun talking about a real church. There was this church in a town called Corinth. And in that, not Mississippi. I imagine none of you know that there's a Corinth in Mississippi, but that's okay. Not the Mississippi one. There's a church in Corinth in the Mideast. And in Corinth, they had a situation. And the Christians there thought that they were being nice by just letting the situation go. They were like, hey, we're just going to let this happen. We're just going to let it play out. Let's see what happens. And what actually was happening was there was a guy having sex with his stepmom. And yeah, that was the real church situation. And it was real awkward because everybody knew. The whole church knew. Now, here's the deal. this is kind of fun. You might not know this. 1 Corinthians is not Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. Did you know this? 2 Corinthians is also not the third letter or the second letter. Okay, so here's what happened. I have a fun, just throw the picture up because it's fun. Okay, this is that's like a little copy of 2 Corinthians that we have. But it's not, it's not the original letter. Here's what happens. In the book of 1 Corinthians, Paul actually says, hey, in my previous letter, and he had brought up some issues to them, and they misunderstood it. You ever misread a text message? You ever misread a voice message? You ever misread a post? You ever listen, y'all are the most cryptic people I've ever seen on, what Instagram notes? Like those things? You guys will post some metaphorical haiku magic that takes like 3 days to, I gotta sit and ponder, what does he mean, all right? Yeah. So here's the deal. Paul wrote a letter. He wrote a letter, and they took the letter, and they got whacked with the letter. And so Paul writes 1 Corinthians, and he's like, guys, you misunderstood me in my previous letter. And so he writes to them. And then he goes and visits the church. And if they were bad the first time, they were worse the second time. So when Paul goes and visits, it's actually worse. They misunderstood him even more. And here's what happens. While he's visiting, there's some beef that happens in the church. Somebody in the church hates Paul and begins to turn on him. Paul had planted this church. Paul had helped start this church. Paul had set up their leaders. Paul had been like a huge part of this church, and they're turning on him. And he's got a guy leading everyone Paul's a jerk. Paul's all of this stuff. And so Paul writes a third letter, and he calls it in 2 Corinthians my severe letter. Hey, have you ever had I know you have. You had that text message that maybe sometime later you were like, man, I wish I could have deleted that, right? I wish I had a filter for my emotions on that. Paul writes a severe letter, and in his severe letter, he corrects them and challenges some of the issues that are happening. And then we get one of the leaders that Paul's been training, a guy named Timothy, who would go on to be part of the books 1st and 2nd Timothy in the Bible. The guy that Paul trained, he goes and visits Corinth, and he reports back to Paul hey, there's some good stuff happening. There's some really good fruit happening here, but I think they misunderstood you again. And this is where we get 2 Corinthians. It's wild, y'all. It's wild. So 2 Corinthians chapter 2, there was this guy in the church who had beef with Paul and made a big deal about it. And it wasn't that, beef probably shouldn't be my word. This guy had sinned. He had done something actually wrong. There's room to think it actually could be the guy who was sleeping with his stepmom, could be that guy who's really mad at Paul. You get it, right? Right? You know, when Paul steps in and is like, hey, this relationship is gross, the guy gets defensive. He's like, back down, right? So maybe that's the same guy. But somebody in this church sins, is doing something wrong. And the church does what they're supposed to do. The church goes in and they have the conversation, hey man, what you're doing is wrong. It's not okay. And he says, I don't care. I think you're wrong. And so they get some people who are impartial. Remember, we used that big word. They're balanced. They're unbiased. They come in. They're like, hey, can we assess the situation? Okay, you're whack. You're still whack. The first person who said you're whack, we agree, you're whack. This is sin. This is wrong. And he says, nah, I'm still against it. And so then the whole church met together and they were like, hey, buddy, we want you to see this. We all disagree with you. Like this, what you're doing, it's not good. It's not okay. And he says, I don't care. And what Paul had said in 1 Corinthians was, hand him over to the devil so that his flesh may be destroyed. Now imagine if you're sitting there and you're reading your Bible one night and you hit that, you're like, what the crap does that mean? Hand my flesh over to the devil? What, right? For destruction? All right, so here's the deal. Here's the deal. What Paul was suggesting is, hey, this guy who is denying and defying what Jesus says, he's saying that what is good is bad and what is bad is good. This guy is not following Jesus anymore. He's not a follower. He's not a Christian. And so we're not going to pretend like he is a Christian anymore. We're not going to pretend like he is. We're going to let him live however he wants to live, not part of this. You do as much sin as you want, man. You do it. Go for it. Live it up. And here's what we know. Here's what the church knows. Here's what the Christians know. They know that sin is destructive and it's poisonous. And here's what happens. All sin has consequences and penalties and casualties. Every sin. Always consequences, always penalties, always casualties. And so here's what happens. When somebody gets to just do them, when they just get to do whatever they want to do, and when whatever they want to do is sin, it destroys their life. Man, I sat with a homeless guy a couple weeks ago, and listen, here's the deal. He knows. He knows everything. He knows everything he's done wrong. He knows about Jesus. He knows what's right. He just sat there. He preached at me. He's got a tattoo of a Bible verse right on it. Seek first his kingdom, right? I mean, he's sharing it all with me. He's like, man, I just keep going back to drugs. I just keep going back. And he's like, and listen, I keep going back. I keep partying too hard. I keep hanging with the wrong people. This is my 4th time out of rehab. Right? And so, what is he admitting? That his flesh is destroyed. Right? Like that the wage of sin has like caught up like to its ultimate. And so here's kind of what the church did. They went hard. They blocked his number. They kicked him out of the group texts. They stopped inviting him to Chili's. They're not even playing. I know they definitely need him on their Rocket League team, but they're like, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to do it. Not going to invite him. We need a 4th, but not tonight. We're going to play 3-on-3. They push this guy out, and the reason is most important. Because for most of us, to get to that point, you get to a threshold where you're very angry with somebody. How many of you loosely followed Johnny Depp and Amber Heard when all of that was going down? Okay. How many of you are loosely following Joe Jonas, Sophie Turner right now? Okay. Oh no, they're separating. I know! Ah! Now here's the deal. What's wild about these things and these moments is that people get swept up into this and they pick sides. You know what I'm talking about? They pick sides. You ever had 2 mutual friends dating and then break up? And then you're like, oh snap, who do I hang out with today? Right? You've had these moments where you're like, oh my goodness, what side am I? And here's the deal. When you've picked a side, quite often it is hard to be gracious. When somebody has wounded you, it's hard to be forgiving. It's hard to be merciful. It's hard to want to forgive somebody. And so there's a few things that Paul discusses with them that I think are important. The first one we've already covered in the previous weeks. Number 1, be strong on sin. Be strong on sin. That's what the church did. They were like, hey, listen, this is sin. It's not okay. We're not going to play with it. We're not going to toy with it. It's like mercury. like back in the day before they knew mercury was poisonous, they'd be like, hey, kids, play with it. Right? And everybody's playing with it in their hands, licking it, like all kinds of stuff. And they're like, oh, those kids are mentally messed up. All right, so now we don't do that. We don't do that. We don't want to be easy or soft on the poison of sin. Be strong on sin. When it's in the church, we call it out. But here's the deal. This is the turn. Be quick to forgive. 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 5. I'm going to start there. He says, I'm not overstating it when I say that the man who caused all the trouble hurt all of you more than he hurt me. I just want you to think about the place that Paul gets to when somebody has been beefing with you, and you turn to your friends and you're like, guys, listen, it hurts you more than it hurts me. I see the effect on, that's a humble thing. Anyway, most of you opposed him, and that was punishment enough. Now, however, it is time to forgive and comfort him. Otherwise, he may be overcome by discouragement. So I urge you now to reaffirm your love for him. It's time to forgive and comfort. I want you to reaffirm your love. I don't want him to get discouraged. Come on. When was the last time that somebody wounded you and you thought, man, I hope they're okay? I really hope they're okay right now. This is the situation. Paul goes, hey, church, understand something. That our goal is to be ministers of reconciliation. I want to read you, I know that's huge. You're like, what words did you just say? 2 Corinthians 5:18. In this same book, Paul says, all of this is a gift from God who brought us back to himself through Christ. And God has given us this task of reconciling people to him. What does it mean to reconcile? It means to fix back together, to bind back together, to take things that are broken and put them back. Do you know what you and I have as a mission that it stands on over our lives? Is that God has given you such a great gift with his kindness and grace and forgiveness that takes every sin you've ever committed and washes them away and says, hey, can I invite you to do some of the work with me in forgiving people and comforting them and restoring them back? The mission that God has for us is, I have forgiven you, I've taken all of your sins, and I've washed them. Would you join me in the work of restoring people back to wholeness? See, in the church, there should not be grudges. There should not be long-held unforgiveness against the person who has come. In fact, there's a time that Jesus says to forgive those who've wounded you, and Peter comes in and goes, okay, but how much? Like how often? What's the line? What's the line? When is the moment that a Christian wrongs me and they're like, hey, I'm sorry, that I go, no, you've stepped over the line. You've gone too far. You are going to hell now. When's that line? What's that line? And Jesus says, okay, if you have somebody, he gives a line. I love it. It's so good. Jesus gives a line. He's like, here's the line. Here's how you know. If somebody sins against you 7 times, 70 times in a day, and each one of those times comes back to you and is like, hey, I'm so sorry. Will you forgive me? And you're like, yeah, that's cool. And then they do it again 490 times in a day. Jesus goes, still keep forgiving. Right? So the max is 491, but that's really somebody messing with you every 15 seconds. I think it's like really, it would be a tough day. Let's just say, can you imagine like like getting slapped in the face and be like, hey, what was that for? Like, hey, man, I'm so sorry. Will you forgive me? Yeah, that's cool. 5, 4, like I just, Jesus says, hey, forgive. Colossians 3:13, forgive as you've been forgiven. He says, make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. I love that phrase, make allowance, because it buffers like a cool word picture for me. You ever have really late friends? Like, yeah, they're late to everything. Maybe it's your parents. Anybody late parents? Okay, do you know what you do with those people? You know what you do with those people? You tell them the wrong time. And you don't tell them, it's not a lie. What you're telling them is, this is the time that I need you moving. I need you moving at 4 o'clock, but really everyone else is moving at 4:15, and that's fine. That's allowance. That's making room. You ever have somebody that you know they're a mooch. You know if you're going to Taco Bell, you know they're going to be like, hey, bro, I didn't bring any money. You just know every single time. You're just like, What do you do? How do you make allowance for that? You bring the money. You bring the extra. Here's what, that's how you make allowance. I'm not saying you have to bring the money every time. I'm just saying that's an example of making allowance. That's an example of making room. That's an example of making space. And here's what Paul says. I want you to make allowance for each other to mess up and be ready to forgive them because Jesus forgave you. Because Jesus forgave you. Oftentimes when somebody wounds me, it's really tricky to get to that place where I right size my problem. Because my problem feels huge in my life. And it is. Some of you have been hurt in unbelievably horrendous ways. Some of you have been wounded in grave ways. And some of you, listen, I spent time this week with two people that I was just not ready for this conversation. I was like, hey, what was life like for you growing up, and just some of these things. And they just unfurled church hurt. And it was just like story after story of like, well, growing up this, church did this, my last church did this, the other church did this, the church I grew up in did this. And it was just, can I be honest? It just hurt to hear it. But it hurts them. I know it hurts them more. And so I don't want to pretend like that forgiveness is this really light, fluffy thing that just like, hey, forgive as you've been forgiven. But I do want to right size it. That every sin that I've committed and every sin that you've committed also has casualties, and also has consequences, and also wreaks havoc. And yet, if you've ever gone before God and said, God, would you forgive me of my sins? Without a second question, without going, do you mean it though? What about what you did 6 years ago? Without any of that, God forgives. And everything that you've ever done, the Bible says it's removed as far as east is from west. And they never touch. It's this grace and this forgiveness that you could never comprehend, even if you and I were to sit and just meditate on the grace of God and on His forgiveness and how good He is to us. We would never fully grasp how good He is. And He's a God who loves you so much that He's willing to overlook everything and invite you to be a part of healing others with it. And so, Vox, as we wrap up Fight Club, it really wasn't a whole lot about fighting. Word. I gave you 0 boxing tips. I don't know how to get out of a headlock. But here's my hope. Here's my hope. My hope from this is that you understand that the greatest fight that you face is not people, it's sin. That it's sin and its effects. The Bible talks about that there's demonic forces warring against you. I know that's weird, like 2023, but it's real. That you have things coming against you. That's literally the greatest source of all of your issues. Sin and its effects and its warring. And you are invited by God to be washed and cleaned and pure and righteous. And to be a part of a community that loves each other so much that it won't tolerate you being sick anymore, and that you shouldn't tolerate others around you being sick, and that works together with forgiveness and grace to heal and restore people.